Good afternoon. My name is Adrian Swenson. I'm the Development Director at Pacific Island Knowledge to Action Resources, headquartered in Salt Lake City, Utah. We are hosting and co-sponsoring this 9th annual Pacific Islander Violence Prevention Conference. This breakout session is entitled "The State of Domestic Violence in Samoa and American Samoa, a comparison of two societies sharing a single culture." Before we get started, please mute yourselves and remain muted throughout this breakout session. Time permitting, we will have question and answer at the end of the presentation. You can submit your questions via the chat feature in your Zoom link.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I wanted to introduce myself as Jennifer Tofaeono, the Executive Director for the American Samoa Alliance Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I want to thank PICTAR leaders in the community for this space, as well as allowing us to share our story. I'm here with my team. That includes Judy Matatia, our training coordinator, and Mrs. Luana Yoshikawa Scanlan from Prime Consultant. We'll be here talking about our work, the state of domestic violence in Samoa and American Samoa, a comparison of two single societies sharing a single culture. But before we start, I really wanted to thank Hina and Nessie for sharing their stories, and Oretta for nurturing and guiding them through a really difficult conversation. Fa'afetai lava for your bravery. What I gained from their discussion is great. It's a great segue into our discussion on how do we continue to express and tell others about who you are or who we are as Pacific Islanders. The Alliance is the recognized dual coalition in American Samoa. We're funded by two federal grants through the Office of Violence Against Women and Family Violence Prevention Services Administration through HHS. Our purpose as a coalition is to strengthen the response to domestic and sexual violence or assault, DVSA, in our communities by increasing awareness. We also provide support for our advocates who work with victims to fortify and improve the response to DVSA for our victims here on our island. When proposing this project, one of our TAs asked me, why do you need to travel to Samoa to do the work you do in American Samoa? Where does it fit within the grant deliverables? What would another coalition ED say about this decision? What does that funding source say about the guidelines to foreign travel? How am I going to be able to defend my decision as an ED in asking for this project? Initially, I was taken aback and I thought, how do I talk to them about my people and where I come from? How do I give them context, voiced in respect? Do I explain to them that I have strong independent roots in the island of Samoa and American Samoa? Many who live here in American Samoa share the same lineage with those in Samoa. I thought, should I send her the photo of Mata'afa Yosefo, who's surrounded by the women when he was banished to live in Saipan for his role in the Mau movement, a nonviolent movement for Samoan independence from colonial rule during the first half of the 20th century? Should I send her a picture of the map of our islands and share the stories of our people, how our people would travel back and forth through the islands, our Samoan people, our chiefs and our kings, our tui, traveling back and forth, sharing stories and sharing love time? Should I send her a picture of our last tui manua that sits there on the left of the slide, where he's wearing his traditional Samoan wear? That the tui manua no longer exists on our island. because of the US rule that there will be no other king on American Samoan soil. Only the US president is to be recognized. And how my people fought this in a US court. Do I try to explain the impact of Christian religion on how we rear our children and the amount of violence that was introduced into the Samoan family in the name of Christianity? To try to explain that in an email wouldn't do this project justice. As you look at these photos, there's a true resemblance because we're the same people. How do you explain this to people who have no perspective or understanding of the impact that we've had to go on, even through the questioning that was asked of me? At that time, I thought they wouldn't understand. So I didn't want to provide the historical references to express the importance of this project. To address this thought of foreign travel, what they consider, I thought to explain that there was never a line between the two Samoans, the islands, until 1899, when Germany and Britain and the US decided how to separate us. The Germans claimed Samoa, the British other Pacific islands, and the US renamed us American Samoa to make sure everyone knew who owned us. The Americans wanted our islands of Tutuila so the US Navy could continue to use it for refueling their ships while providing the US presence in the Pacific, along with Saipan and Guam. Although the US may consider it foreign travel, I know many Samoans across the islands who have used Ancestry.com and find that we're still connected by blood. We may be separated by this line, we're connected by lineage, language, our cultural practices, and the Fa'asamoa, or the Samoan way. I didn't share this information, but I should have. And now today, I know I have the language and the vocabulary to do that. To preface some of these difficult discussions about our history and how it impacts the work we do. What I did share with her was that in my brief time of when I first started working with the Alliance, I recognized most of the data we use to report violence against Samoan women is primarily from the independent island of Samoa, not American Samoa. It's difficult to find data here on sexual assault and domestic violence. In Samoa, they report 68% of the Samoan women there have been abused. You won't find that type of data here in American Samoa. Samoa has developed media campaigns. They've had advocates who voice their concerns how domestic violence and sexual assault impacts their families there. A Samoan female judge stated in their court, the most detrimental issue in Samoa was the violence within the family, particularly on women. During that same week that she stated that, in American Samoa, our Chief Justice stated that immigration issues were the most pressing on our community. You could research Samoa domestic violence on the internet and find blogs with comments from Samoan advocates. But in American Samoa, information about domestic violence is derived from court reports. It's rare to see blogs from American Samoa talking about domestic violence. Before this project, it was extremely rare to find any narrative or story from American Samoa victims that would inform or identify the plight of Samoan women who face domestic violence. It made me think, how is it that our sisters and our brothers in Samoa who share the same cultures, heritage, lineage, the Matai systems, the Fa'asamoa, why is American Samoa lacking in its approach to fighting domestic violence? If you look at the photos, we have the same Matai system. The top photos are two Matais from American Samoa. The bottom photo are those from Western Samoa or Samoa. And then we look exactly the same. When you look at the language that we speak, we all speak Samoan. Our religion is extremely important to the Samoan people, like many Pacific Islanders. We have more churches on our island than you'll ever see, which is my belief, anywhere. Every village has a church, not just one or two, but sometimes 3, 4, or 5. And on the third section there, those photos, you'll see that in Samoa and American Samoa, we still have our traditional fale in our villages. Our islands are filled with lush vegetation. We share the same beautiful sunsets. We are the same people. We live in the same environment. It was important for our TA to understand what made us similar, but it was critical that I also helped our TA to understand what made us different and its impact on the work we do. In this picture on the bottom left-hand side, you'll see the parliamentary and the phono. Samoa has a parliamentary system like the British, and American Samoa has the phono, which is based off the US government systems. They're different, but we both use and incorporate our Samoan culture. In American Samoa, the House of Representatives are voted by the people. But our senators are part of the Matai system, where our families choose who's going to represent us in the Senate. In Samoa, the Matai also plays a huge part of the parliamentary system. They have a head of state, because they're an independent country, who along with the parliament chooses the prime minister. And I'm proud to say that Samoa has voted their first female prime minister. Her name is Fiame Naomi Mataafa. American Samoa has a US governor, and until 1970s, US governors were appointed by the government, the US government. In 1970, we voted in our first Samoan governor. Excuse me. Our current governor is Governor Lemanu Peletimonga. Samoa, as an independent country, is part of the United Nations, and they're required to accept the many charters that the UN provides, one being the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. This is when you start to realize our infrastructure was created by those who governed or govern us, how they have a huge impact in how we do the work. Samoa, as a part of the United Nations, receives direct funding to develop the research on how domestic violence impacts Samoan women. The US is part of the UN Charter, and as such, American Samoa follows our US government lead, they choose what parts of the UN we get to use. The US government determines the work we do and how we do it. And it also then creates the funding and the mechanisms within the funding and the guidelines. And that's where this question comes from our TA. I think if there's one thing I would point out, it's the impact of decision-making of rules with limited knowledge or context of who we are that can make it difficult for us to move our people forward. It was really important that that be expressed so that we can do these different approaches to encourage knowledge and understanding for our TA. Needless to say, we were approved, and that's of course why we're here to share our story. We received our foreign travel approval to venture on our 16-seat prop plane to fly 30 minutes to Samoa, a foreign country. So with that being said, I'm going to now turn it over to Judy Matatia, who will continue to share about her experience as the gatherer of stories through this project. Thank you.
So talofa everyone, I am Judy Matatia, the training coordinator with the American Samoa Alliance Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. So I wanted to share my experience as the lead person of the team that gathered this information from the two Samoas and we prepared ourselves for it, and how we prepared ourselves for it. Considering this was my first time in doing something like this, going out and trying to get this kind of information from a community, a culture, and people that are very conservative, where many believe that the issue of domestic and sexual violence is taboo and off limits, causing discussions to be dismissed and in many cases still today are forbidden. And so all of us interviewers are Samoans, female advocates employed by the Alliance. Some are no longer with us. And from our extensive experience working and some having lived in both Samoas, we were able to effectively connect with principal government leaders and social advocates. It was a huge learning experience for me. I thought I knew what I knew, or that I already knew so much, until I got out there, and then afterwards I would consistently think about the stories I was told during the interviews and focus groups and discussions. I didn't realize it then, but in some way I was preserving these stories, their stories. Even if it was just research or gathered information, it was their life story. So not only was it a learning experience for me, it was a humbling experience as well, as I was honored that strangers would entrust me with their stories and trust that the truth of their stories be told through our research and assessment, and that the Alliance would tell the truth of their stories. So the training we got to prepare ourselves to gather this information at the Alliance, and in any case, training is a vital part of anything we do, especially when we're doing something new. Then we train ourselves, or are provided with technical assistance to train staff before we get thrown into the shark tank, right? And it was so different in this case, and it was no different in this case of gathering information for this project. And I am so grateful that we had the opportunity to get trained on interviewing key informants, facilitating focus groups, being able to lead discussions, and so forth, because I still apply it to the work today. And it strengthens my ability to handle some of the challenges I face in the work today. So training for interviewing key informants included how to ask what types of questions, and my favorite, knowing how and when to probe when I'm not getting the answers. And at the same time, being careful that I don't come off annoying the interviewee and get thrown out before I get what I came for, right? And so how to facilitate focus groups was another vital part of the training. And that's when I learned that a focus group is not to educate people, but rather to listen to their thoughts and beliefs. So more so for me, it was to educate me. That was the time where rather educating people, I was educating myself. So it can also be challenging to get participants to voice their opinions freely, especially our Samoan people, or to get honest opinions for sensitive topics such as violence, such as domestic violence, especially sexual assault. And so we had to learn how to lead those kind of discussions and create safe spaces for participants to be able to embrace their voice and share freely and honestly. And most importantly, for us to be able to listen. Today, I still facilitate a couple of focus groups when needed. And I can honestly say that I've improved a lot today versus my first focus group. And it is one of those things today that I no longer fear of heading or facilitating. I'm no queen or pro on focus groups or anything, just saying that with the training and especially the experience, I can do it. And so if I can do it, anyone out there can do it too. It can be a bit intimidating for beginners, but as we say in Samoa, if I fayalele, practice makes perfect. So anyone can do it. Anyone can do it. In making connections, being able to create safe spaces for those I connected with or interviewed was and still is today in continuing the work an important component in connecting with the community, the interviewees, because I realized that the information I needed depended on how safe people were feeling, and that there would be no limits to their shared information once they felt safe. And that was up to me to create by my responses, the language I used, my body language, the way I looked or dressed, and making sure that I didn't react to what people were sharing if it wasn't in line with my personal beliefs as a female, my personal beliefs as a victim survivor, as a researcher, as a Samoan, my beliefs as a Christian, as a working woman and mother, and as a human being. So creating safe spaces for those I had interviewed was very important, and it was a major contributing factor to the success of the research. And I knew I had secured a safe space or succeeded in locking down a safe space in place. I knew that was the case when I could feel the integrity of the sharing, the information, and it went beyond an interview. It became a telenovela session. We were talking stories. There were shared experiences, the history, the culture, and so forth. So there was so much to learn through these connections. And the learning continues today. For instance, some of them are partners of the Alliance today, strong partners too, may I add. And so creating and maintaining those connections is very important. And I strongly encourage anyone that we can be safe spaces to be able to make connections. And everyone can be a safe space and place for others. Interviewing key stakeholders on foundational questions. We conducted face-to-face interviews here in American Samoa, and then during several trips to Samoa, as Jennifer had mentioned, and used email questionnaires with informants whose schedules could not meet ours in a timely manner, which were only a few. Interviews with key stakeholders were conducted using a generative series of foundational questions that focused on 3 areas. 1, how domestic violence is handled or dealt with by law enforcement, the court system, in the village or village councils, by the village councils, and within families. The other area of focus was the extent to which domestic violence is a priority concern in the lives of Samoan people and their awareness and knowledge of domestic violence. And the third area of focus was on resources available and needed for victims of domestic violence, the perpetrators of domestic violence, and the institutions that are tasked with creating laws to protect people from domestic violence, as well as those who enforce those laws. And so the underlying theme in all these areas was the relationship between domestic violence and Fa'asamoa, or our Samoan culture. And without explicitly including the Fa'asamoa in our line of questioning, we were able to move beyond the informant's professional knowledge, their attitudes, and beliefs to probe into their understanding of cultural protocols and the unique dynamics of Samoan family life. Again, my experience, I gained so much understanding and appreciation of my culture and my language from these interviews and discussions. Sorry, I always get emotional when I talk about my culture and my language. I learned that my Fa'asamoa today is very different from the Fa'asamoa of my parents 50 plus years ago, 70, 80 years ago, and the Fa'asamoa of my grandparents over 100 years ago. And although the foundation might be the same throughout generations, practices and applications vary and differ. The Samoan word for woman is fafine, and I learned that in the word fafine in the Samoan translation of the Bible always has a negative connotation to it. Since then, I no longer refer to women as fafine. I use the word tamaitai and prefer to be referred to as tamaitai or tina. I always feel like I take away more than what I give in any learning discussion, in these interviews, in these focus groups, in these discussions for this project, for this certain project. The learning and knowledge gained through this project for me and my team was abundant. and it can be the same for those interested in obtaining information for certain projects. In recording their stories that we were able to get while conducting interviews and focus groups. Interviews were recorded except for one informant in Samoa who asked not to be recorded. All recorded interviews were transcribed by the interviewers to Word documents in English, and everyone is advised that, you know, the interview is being recorded. We have them sign consent forms and so forth. So interviews were conducted using the informant's language preference, either Samoan or English. Interviews done in Samoan were transcribed and translated into English, and a lot of the translation, if not all, was done by myself. And being very mindful not to take away from the actual idea or content that was shared. Not take away from their shared stories, because with my experience in doing this work, in translating and back translating, the idea behind a statement can change when surrounding conditions are not considered during translation. And that's why I don't translate verbatimly or word for word, but instead by context, by taking into consideration those surrounding conditions, especially in our line of work, especially when it comes to domestic violence. It was important that we record and transcribe the very same day. This was another thing that we were trained on, because as interviewers and researchers, we wanted to include our thoughts, our feelings or emotions, whatever was going through our minds and experiences from these interviews while they were still fresh in our mind, which was another part of our training in doing this project. So this was one of the challenges for me, because our time in another country was limited. And so we hit the ground running. I had to book interviews back-to-back interviews, or 2 or 3 interviews per day, and therefore had to submit the same amount of information the same day. I have to admit, it was more than a challenge. It was one of the challenges, but it was more than a challenge. I struggled. I sucked at it, and keeping up with transcribing, translating, I struggled with that. But it was all part of the learning process, this new process, and we were determined to be better at it. And we are better at it. I am better at it. And so all in all, this was a major project for me and my team at the time, who were all doing this for the first time. But we took it and we ran with it. We didn't let anyone tell us that we couldn't do it because we didn't have the educational background or experience like others that are doing the same kind of projects. It was a huge learning experience for me. And I find myself in today's work sharing a lot of the same information and experience from executing this project. Our communication skills, especially listening skills and abilities, played a vital role in all of this. And of course, we had an awesome support team, which was leadership and management of the organization of the Alliance. Without them and their support, this wouldn't have been able to come to fruition. I hope my story and experience helps empower anyone that is faced with the same kind of projects and is feeling insecure because of their educational background of experience. Believe in yourself that the work you do can be done, and ask for support when needed. Very important that we understand what we need and not be afraid to ask for that support. Thank you for this opportunity.
My name is Luana Scanlan, and my role in the project was as a consultant, providing the technical assistance and the training that Judy mentioned. And I also helped to manage the gathering process, the data gathering process, the analysis, developing the project framework, and then the final writing of the reporting, the findings and everything for everybody. Okay, so we'll start with the framework. I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that this was not a science-based research project. However, it was guided by the principles of community-based participatory research, in that the community was fully involved with the ideation and development of the project and the gathering and the interpretation of the data. My part of this presentation involves the methodology and findings, and I'll provide more detail on that gathering process as well. This project does represent the Alliance's first major attempt to fill the gap in local data about domestic violence and sexual assault, which Jennifer alluded to earlier, that we do have a major gap possibly in information, statistics, experiences, and a lot of it has to do with the lack of infrastructure within our own government, local government, to collect that data. So it kind of falls upon the NGOs like the Alliance to do this work. The report summarizes the findings of the 33 key informant interviews, 15 with individuals living in American Samoa and 18 living in the country of Samoa, during a 6-month inquiry to assess the differences and similarities in the knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs amongst the Samoans in each country concerning domestic violence. So in terms of methodology, Judy provided some information specifically about her experience in doing the work, but I'll add here that a little more description about how we went about doing it. The key informants provided a lot of insight from a range of perspectives, including different genders, ethnicity, ages, etc. They were asked to draw on their own understanding and experiences and to reflect on the understandings and experiences of others in their private and professional lives. For example, if they were interviewing a Tofaeono, we not only wanted to understand their experience as a Tofaeono and as perhaps a father, a family figure, but also their experience in helping people in their congregations who may be dealing with domestic violence and sexual assault. So there was the questions that were asked, like Judy said, probing was a major issue because you never know how far to probe, how much is too much. Yet they were really good. The interviewers were really good about maintaining respectful distance while still gathering the information that we needed to get this done. Thus, these interviews provide an intimate view of the actual versus the intended relationship between the Samoa society and the behavior of Samoan people in terms of domestic violence. Because we all know that people will say certain things are happening or they're doing certain things, but in reality, that's not what they're doing. That's not what is happening. They may share certain things to make it look okay on the surface. What we were trying to do is get below that. The key informant interviews are just one of 3 data collection methods in the project. We also included a literature review and focus groups, as Judy mentioned, and those are discussed in a separate report from the one that we're using today. The literature is discussed also in the report to provide the context and historical involvement of domestic violence issues in the 2 Samoas, which we won't go into detail today. Key informants were identified in both Samoas based on their area of professional expertise and categorized into one of the following groups: advocacy, faith-based, judicial, law enforcement, education, healthcare, or other. And as Judy stated, the interviewers conducted face-to-face interviews during these 3 trips to Samoa, also locally in American Samoa, and used email questionnaires with informants whose schedules couldn't meet theirs in a timely manner. Interviews were recorded, as she said, except for one informant in Samoa who asked not to be recorded. Instead, we used written notes, which were included in the final data analysis. Without explicitly including the Samoa in their line of questioning, the interviewers were able to move beyond the informant's professional knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs to probe into their understanding of the cultural protocols and the unique dynamics of Samoan family life that may affect how they deal with and understand domestic violence. So the data analysis was a constructive process in that as interviewers or gatherers, they constructed meaning from the experience of gathering. And I think Judy really gave us a good description of that when she was doing the interviews, she realized that it wasn't just data. It was these interviewees' stories. They were sharing things that were private. They were giving of themselves. And so that experience of gathering, understanding these relationships and the dynamics involved, as well as the interviewees' responses, created the actual meaning that we got from the project, the data that we got from the project. It's not just statistics, it's not just quotes. There were actual feelings and self-reflections that were going on during the process. We also did not predicate our methodology on any existing theory. We were aware of our own biases and the impact that our personal experiences could have on the gathering process. And so that was pointed out during the training. We also had 6 questions that we considered when coding and analyzing data that was coming in. And I'd like to point out that we were doing this, as Judy said, immediately. So as interviews were being done, we were trying to immediately transcribe to ensure that no information, no feelings, no impressions were lost. And from each interview, we learned more and we were able to adapt and change the probing questions so that for the next interview, we were a little bit smarter, more akamai. We knew, okay, we can ask it in a different way, or we maybe needed to turn in a different direction. So the 6 questions when coding and analyzing the data were: number 1, what common themes were emerging in responses, in the responses, and how these patterns or lack of patterns help to illuminate our subject matter. Are there deviations from these patterns? And if so, are there any factors that might explain them? How are the interviewees' environments and past experiences related to their attitudes and beliefs? What interesting stories were emerging from the responses? Do any of these patterns suggest that additional information is needed? And are the patterns that emerge similar to the findings of other stories that we've identified in our literature review? And if not, what might explain these discrepancies? Here we provide some background on the progress of women's rights and identities in each Samoa. Now, this is something that we learned through the interviews. Jennifer touched on it at the beginning, but there is we've identified a really big difference between the 2 Samoas, and that was in how the governments in each country impact the progress of women's rights. So the status of women in each of the countries is complex, and in its simplest explanation, women share equal rights with men within the context of the Fa Samoa. However, while American Samoans and Samoans share the same culture, the impact of Westernization has resulted in the adaptation of some values and perspectives towards a more modern status quo concerning gender roles in the U.S. American Samoa. In the laws concerning domestic violence, in the US, laws concerning domestic violence are supported as human rights, and they're protected in various pieces of legislation institutionalized over the past 30 years. However, and this is something that we learned through our own personal research, I didn't realize this, from 1789, when the US Amendment 13, Section 1 of the Constitution was passed to criminalize slavery and involuntary servitude, nothing was done since 1789 to further the protection or advancement of women in the US until the 1990s. So the raising of public awareness by nonprofits representing domestic violence victims and women, those feminists and survivors in the US, became the catalyst for that change. While these federal laws provide the lead for and have tremendous impact upon the development of legislation in American Samoa, unfortunately, we really don't have any NGOs advocating for legislative change here. In 2004, the American Samoa Fono passed the Title 47 of American Samoa's Code Annotated Domestic and Family Violence, which defines domestic violence, civil orders for protection, and duties of the court. It also assigns responsibilities to the departments of police and court probation for the processing of DV cases and filing protection orders. However, that Title 47 provides very little in the way of criminalizing domestic violence itself. Rather, it defines domestic violence as an aggravating factor when occurring with other criminal violations. So in and of itself, domestic violence is not a crime. In contrast, Samoa has achieved significant progress in legislation and advocacy against domestic violence over the last 15 years, owing to two specific sources: the United Nations, which monitors the human rights issues in Samoa, and the subsequent social awareness and advocacy initiatives led by the OVW's counterpart in Samoa, which is the Ministry of Women, Community, and Social Development. This is an amazing ministry. They have put out at least two major reports in Samoa, backed by the UN, of course, funded by the UN. But they produced the most data about Samoan women and domestic violence. This information provides some of the background for understanding how domestic violence is handled by the authorities in each country, which impacts the social norms surrounding DV in these respective communities. And this information helped us to understand and set the context for some of the findings that came out of the data. So here there were three themes that emerged from the data. Key informants from both Samoas reveal similar value systems and understandings of domestic violence, but there's one unique difference between the two, and that is the informants from American Samoa point to causes emerging from acculturation and modernization of the culture, whereas informants from Samoa suggested that DV is caused by multiple stress factors originating from a more traditional lifestyle, dominance by men over women or gender inequality, and the Fa Samoa. Informants from Samoa tend to use the words gender-based violence and intimate partner violence more often than those in American Samoa, which to us demonstrated perhaps a deeper understanding of and familiarity with the dynamics of domestic violence. Informants suggest work-related and financial problems as a key cause of the breakdown of social norms. One respondent pointed to the effects of non-Samoan influences on the Fa Samoa, which affects the family's values and a man's view of and valuation of the woman. That was a direct quote. Key informant statements also asserted that the Fa Samoa has been interpreted over the years by the Samoan people and religious leaders in ways that rationalize violence to ensure social harmony and cultural propriety. Another statement was that, well, this isn't a statement, but this is an assertion from a group of statements, that the Fa Samoa can also be a means of protecting Samoan people from violence if the government and churches can focus on educating the public on what DV is and teach alternative behaviors to cope with domestic problems. Finally, there is a high level of awareness of the DV in Samoa, and that leadership is committed to an organized response that reduces human rights violations. And it should be noted here, well, we know what Jennifer stated was that, you know, Samoa now has its first female prime minister who was elected in 2021. And I believe your next presenter, Doris Tulifau, may be able to share more on the impact of that historical event. A Faifeau from Samoa perceptively described the state of the Fa Samoa today. He said, when we say Fa Samoa of when? Is it now, when Samoa became independent in the 60s? Or is it the time of the missionaries? We connect with our culture, but no culture stays the same. And cultures are mixed now with technology and so forth. And so this goes back to what Judy mentioned, that the Fa Samoa for her is different from what her grandparents and her parents practice. The foundation of Fa Samoa is intensely perpetuated throughout generations of Samoans, regardless of where they live. The ideals of God and family before self, the identity of self as part of a whole, while affected over time by modernization, are still very much intact. At the core of this identity is one's place within the context of the family and the community. So to eradicate domestic violence in the Samoas advocates are tasked with innovating methods within the context of the Samoa. We cannot get away from it. We cannot ignore it. Efforts will not be sustainable without implicating the culture in prevention, legislation, enforcement, and rehabilitation. Suggestions from our interviewees for incorporation of Samoa in prevention include engagement of village councils, the Mafutanga Tina and Tama, Yamanga, and county coalitions. This is in American Samoa. Additionally, non-government groups must work together to leverage limited resources and speak as one voice, sending a consistent message to the community to destigmatize victimization by DV and raise awareness and enable individuals to speak out against it. Right now, we don't even have a help hotline, sorry. A hotline with direct referral to appropriate resources is also needed. This type of hotline has experienced success in Samoa by providing a means for anonymous reporting and a referral channel between non-government groups and law enforcement, according to the Ministry of Police there. A link to the full report includes recommendations resulting from the assessment and it is available on the Alliance's website under resources. We want to thank you very much for this opportunity to share our findings and all of your input, your feedback and comments. Thank you very much.
So, okay, thank you, Luana. So I guess this is a time that we'll just open it up for questions, if there are any within there were some that were on the chat group. If I can ask this one, I wanted to make sure that we get a sense from the team. This one was presented in working with victims of domestic violence in Samoa, and I'm going to believe that that's independent Samoa, island of Samoa. Where have you seen in your work the most pushback from our Samoan community in Samoa, as well as the most growth, especially in the cultural context with cultural norms and practices? And where can we find that data? Judy and Luana, did you have anything to add on that?
So for me, with the experience during this project, I would say it was the awareness, like Lou had mentioned in one of the slides, is the awareness. And geographically, they had mentioned that a lot of the awareness doesn't make it to the rural areas or the outer areas of the island. And Samoa is two big islands versus American Samoa. We're really small compared to Samoa, and especially when you're looking at the population, right? So in doing focus groups, and this was like 5-6 years ago, in conducting the focus groups and everything, a lot of them shared how, oh, we don't recognize those programs. Oh, we've never heard of that. So the awareness, it still seems that there's a lack of awareness in the rural areas, in the outer areas, or some of us might say Ikwa, you know, in those villages in the way back sides of the parts of the island. At the same time, there is a lot of awareness, like in the central areas of the island where there's, you know, where it's more industrialized. There's a lot of awareness there. There are people, there are programs, you know, and they have a lot of the programs from that are funded and backed up by the United Nations. So that's something I can think of right now. I know there's a lot of others, but I wanted to, the other thing also I wanted to mention here was along the lines of awareness is victim blaming amongst our people, because it's, and some of us even say it's part of the culture. You know, it's part of our culture that we be like that, or that we, you know, but it's not part of our culture. Samoa does not condone violence or any form of violence, but the victim blaming is there, even within our families. And then of course, the growth is when people are getting that awareness, and many are getting that awareness, like, and especially with programs such as Maluseu's, the programs that she has for the youth in Samoa, and they're made aware, they're getting the training, they're getting the education about these issues, because victim blaming is still a big part of our lives today that we don't think is we're victim blaming. At the same time, we don't realize that we're victim blaming. So that's something I wanted to share along those lines of that question.
Thanks,
I hope
Judy.
it answers the question.
Thank you, Judy. We have about 5 minutes, so I want to get to the other
Sorry.
two. No, thank you. The other one was real quick. So when Samoans leave Western countries for whatever reason and return back to Samoa, are they bringing good, bad practices with them? How has this changed the culture in Samoa? Really quickly, I say anybody that goes back and forth, they always bring baggage, and it's no different within our community. We do have, it used to be the practice that they would send the children that had bad behavior back to the islands to teach them how to be better. And yet they would come with these behaviors and impact and influence those that are here. So there is that. But the next question, and I'm so sorry, I'll have Judy or Luana answer this. Curious to know the local law enforcement collaboration and efforts in implementing a more cohesive and safe space when working with DV victims' families in Samoa.
And again, it seems like, I'm sorry, Lou, did you want to answer this? Did you
No,
want to
I
share
was
with
just
us?
going to ask what was the question in that. I didn't, sorry, I missed the question. Go ahead.
I guess they're curious to know about the local law enforcement collaboration and the efforts in implementing a more cohesive and safe space when working with DV victims and families in Samoa.
Oh, okay.
I can speak really quickly on this as well. That's one of the things as the executive director for the Alliance is that we're trying to create more spaces that we can work with our service providers. And currently we are working to strengthen and help train and develop our law enforcement group in our language with our cultural beliefs. So we're working to connect with those that are Samoan and can make sure that we can develop these curriculums. And so they are definitely Samoan professors, individuals from New Zealand, Samoa, that can really help us to ensure that our people can be trained in our language, and also to bridge the gap between the American US thinking of engaging with victims and how we do that in a Samoan way. And then the last one I'll take is, can you tell us more regarding the age groups you interviewed? Did any part of your data collection include intimate partner violence data for LGBTQI+ folks?
I'm trying to go through the report. I know the age group was probably between 30 to 75.
Yeah.
It was not the younger group from what I remember. I'm looking through the report now.
And the other thing, while Luana's looking it up, the other thing is that we did not focus on the LGBTQIA community, but we recognize their importance in our community. So we do have another grant that we're currently working on. It's a rural grant, and that is to identify for our LGBTQIA, but primarily our Fa'afafine community, as to how they need to get service provision. What is the type of language that our service providers should know to ensure that they feel safe, that we create brave and safe spaces of inclusion and diversity to ensure that they also get treated and seen. So we're working on that, and we will be happy to share that with you in the future. And I see that Doris Mateo is also sharing some information that you can find on the UN. And of course, that is a big thing. Having that UN backing for Samoa has been able to allow them to create a lot of these, ask these questions in Samoa and get some of these going. And we're following right behind. I think that we're good. I just want to say one more thing. Once again, I want to thank the organizers and those at PICTAR for allowing us the space to share the work that we've we're doing here in American Samoa. We hope that it helps to give you an idea that if you need partnership, we are here in American Samoa. And if you want to give us ideas, we are all about collaboration. We are the Alliance. I want to thank my speakers, my fellow speakers, Judy Matatia, for doing a wonderful presentation on what she did. And also the great part of Luana Yoshikawa Scanlan for always being the evaluator that we need. And thank you everybody on this panel, this group for just listening. We so appreciate you. Thank you so much.